Hello, my name is Thane and I like to experiment with AI art and other things AI as well, like AI-generated voices and AI-generated music. Unfortunately, most of the people did not like my actual voice, so for now I will be sticking with this AI-generated voice. For anyone wondering, this was generated with Murph.ai. I may do some more experiments with AI voices in the future as well, but this is the one I am most comfortable with at the moment. But going to the actual topic of this video, I decided to check out some of the most popular fantasy worlds from books, video games, TV series or movies. I really like the genre, as you may already have noticed. I wanted to see what comes out when you just mention the name of a fantasy world instead of referencing the book, video game, TV series or movie. The idea behind it was to perhaps reduce the appearance of famous characters or covers or posters and instead look at how Midjourney depicts the worlds themselves. For this video I have used the current default version of Midjourney, which is 5.1. You can set it with either /settings, adding --v5.1 to your prompt. Or depending on if it is still the default style when you watch this video, it will come automatically until a different version will be set as the default by Midjourney. I have selected some fantasy worlds to prompt on their own, and after that also with another word to specify the subject of the image a little bit more. Some of them I am myself very familiar with and others I have no experience with, but I'll let you know. The fantasy world itself I have prompted in 3 aspect ratios that are 1:1, 9:16 and 16:9. These are just the ones I have selected, and they are probably also commonly most used aspect ratios. There are other possibilities as well, but exploration of those is not currently the goal of this video. I selected 3 different aspect ratios just because the results with exactly the same prompt are different when aspect ratio is changed in the prompt. But for the word combinations for landscape, wildlife, macro, city, interior, architecture, portrait, fantasy and sci-fi, I have used the aspect ratio 9:16. To make the comparisons more easier, I have selected --seed 777. That just kind of removes one level of randomization from the process. And depending on when you're watching this video, you might be able to get the exact same images with the exact same prompt. Also, I have added a --no watermark to reduce the appearance of watermarks in the image, which seem to be the most problematic thing appearing in the 5.1 version. In advance, I would also like to apologize for any mistakes in my video. There probably will be some that slip through. I am usually very diligent with double-checking everything, but recently I have even noticed myself making more and more mistakes. But enough about that, otherwise this short video will again become an hour-long video due to me having so much to say. First, let's journey to Westeros, the fictional continent from J.R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, where noble houses vie for power in a land filled with political intrigue and epic battles. So right away we start with a land that I am actually quite familiar with. I have watched both the TV series and even read a few of the books. On its own we may be getting something that somewhat resembles the Red Keep, but not quite. All of the images are toned down in colors, it would seem. The nature images do look nice, but not entirely recognizable as places from Westeros. I do remember a white stag being a prominent animal in the story, so there seems to be a few of them. No direwolves though. Macro looks totally random. The cities look cool, possibly reminding a little bit of the cities of Westeros, but barely. The interiors do have a Westerosi feel in my opinion. And the architecture seems to be doing some compilations that don't really look like anything familiar to me. I don't recognize the faces in the portraits. What do you think? Do they look like characters from the series? Fantasy seems to be mixing in some fairy tale elements, but still not closer. And sci-fi seems to be a difficult mix, we see impressive castles and one floating spaceship planet. From Westeros, we venture into Middle-earth, the vast and detailed realm created by J.R.R. Tolkien, where the battle between good and evil unfolds in an epic saga of hobbits, elves, dwarves, and men. Another one of fantasy worlds I am familiar with. I have seen the movies, but not read the books. The mentioning of Middle-earth seems to be giving all of the images kind of an epic and cinematic feel with castles and mountains. But the places here do look kind of familiar. I guess Midjourney has put its own spin on top of these. The landscapes really are on point, snowy mountains in the distance. The bear looks kind of like a hobbit carrying a backpack. And macro is again very random, but looking great. I guess it's been a while since I've seen the movies, but I don't remember the cities looking anything like that. The interiors are looking fantastical and they could fit the theme. And architecture too. But oddly enough, there have been no recognizable places or buildings yet. I guess the entire fantasy world must be too wide of a subject to create something that is actually recognizable. And there are different mediums and depictions of these worlds. I have even played a video game based on the series. The people in the portraits are not really recognizable, although the woman could be an elf. There are some more epic views and castles in fantasy and sci-fi. I don't remember seeing any dinosaurs or dragons in Lord of the Rings. Leaving Middle-earth, we enter the enchanted world of Narnia, as imagined by C.S. Lewis, where children stumble upon a magical wardrobe that leads them to a realm filled with talking animals, mythical creatures, and epic adventures. I am not that familiar with this world, although I have heard of it and I may have seen one of the movies from the film series. But we seem to be getting some lions in a snowy forest. I do believe it looks kind of familiar for this fantasy world. The snowy forest theme seems to be continuing on in the nature images. And we see lions in wildlife and surprisingly in macro images as well. The cities seem to be a mix of kind of modern and something resembling of a fantasy world. Architecture looks quite good, snow continues too. But I have no idea if the interiors should look like that or something else. I do believe that Narnia's main characters were children, so that's what we see for portraits too. And a lot of lions there too. I have noticed that the 5.1 style seems to quite often make the animals abnormally large and then has some humans standing next to the animals, making the animals 3 or 4 times larger than the humans. I like the outcome of the sci-fi images. The nice wintry world is present there too, along with some alien objects. Next, we board the Hogwarts Express to the renowned School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, located in the magical world of Harry Potter created by J.K. Rowling, where young wizards and witches learn to harness their magical abilities and face challenges. Again, I am more experienced with the visual side of fantasy, as in I have seen the movies, but not read the books. But the place does look familiar. And I guess this time it is easier as well than with the previous fantasy worlds, because Hogwarts is a more contained place, being just the school and not an entire continent or planet. The landscape and macro images look more like Neuschwanstein Castle to me. It could be the aspect ratio or just the fact that it is the inspiration for many fantasy castles. And fittingly, in wildlife images we get quite many owls. City images seem to be straying off topic a bit, as do the architecture images. The interiors do look quite what they should look like, lots of candles and arches and bookshelves and a huge staircase, possibly magical. The portraits don't really look that familiar to me. And fantasy and sci-fi are again doing similar looking castles like landscape and macro had. The sci-fi part doesn't really affect the images at all this time. And we also have those exaggerated moons appearing here quite often. Stepping away from Hogwarts, we find ourselves in Tamriel, the fictional continent in the beloved video game series The Elder Scrolls, where players embark on quests, unravel ancient prophecies and explore a richly detailed fantasy world. I am quite familiar with this game series and have played Oblivion, Skyrim and also Elder Scrolls Online, which featured a really big portion of Tamriel. And these views do look like they're out of a video game, and specifically an Elder Scrolls game. I can't really tell what these locations could be in Tamriel, but the look and feel certainly feels like Tamriel to me. Landscapes and macro fit quite well in my opinion. There is certainly the feel of the games. The anthropomorphic deer in the lower left wildlife image is hilarious. Also, I don't know what it is with all of these fantasy worlds that macro images don't look anything like macro, they're just random stuff. All of the architecture-related images do have a look and feel of Tamriel. Kind of medieval and houses built from stone. Also, the look is kind of out of a video game, although the quality in these images looks a bit better than the graphics in the games look like. The portraits do look like people and armor that could be found in the Elder Scrolls games, but not recognizable characters though. Fantasy and sci-fi have some nice misty images. Some of the views of the sci-fi could be views of an alien planet, but I guess it is so subtle that it is hardly noticeable. Leaving Tamriel, we enter Azeroth, the expansive world of the popular video game franchise World of Warcraft, where players choose their faction and embark on epic quests in a realm teeming with diverse races, mythical creatures, and warring factions. And this is yet another game franchise that I am very familiar with, having played the game for a decade. I have also seen the movie and listened to some of the books as audiobooks, so the lore of it is also very familiar to me. And based on how familiar I am with the look of the game, these don't really look like any actual places in Azeroth. The colors are reminiscent of the colorful artwork of World of Warcraft, but Midjourney definitely has put its own spin on them. The landscapes look totally alien, nothing like Azeroth. The wildlife and macro images are actually starting to remind something about the game. Especially the bear in the lower right wildlife image, the dragons of macro and the warriors with white beards. Cities and architecture look otherwise great, except they don't look like anything in Azeroth. Interiors do fit better, although there's just so much detail there and too many stained glass windows in my opinion. Now portraits do really look like the art style of World of Warcraft, also the fantasy images except the castle. And sci-fi strays off a lot. The views of Exodar and the Draenei stuff would have really fit here, but instead we get kind of generic sci-fi. Don't get me wrong, the images look great, but they're definitely not Azeroth. Venturing into the realm of fantasy literature, we encounter Krynn, the central setting of the Dragonlance series created by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman, a world populated by diverse characters, dragons, and a rich tapestry of magical lore. And actually this is one that I had never even heard of before. But we do get dragons. And I like that the majority of colors seem to be red, pink and grey, kind of an overarching theme in almost all of the images. But I guess this fantasy world is kind of obscure for Midjourney as it tends to be more influenced by the default Midjourney style, especially in the wildlife and macro. Although we do see some dragons in the macro images. Cities and architecture really look more towards the Midjourney default style. Interiors look different though, not unlike what we've seen with other fantasy worlds, yet still kind of in the fantasy realm. For portraits we get some bearded men with twirled moustaches. If anyone is familiar with this fantasy world, let me know if this is a characteristic of a character in the series. Fantasy and sci-fi kind of have similar looks. From Krynn, we step into Discworld, the imaginative creation of Terry Pratchett, a flat, disc-shaped world balanced on the backs of 4 elephants standing atop a giant turtle, where absurdity, satire, and wit blend seamlessly in hilarious adventures. Another world that I am not familiar with at all and had never even heard of before. But the turtle theme looks quite prominent. And there's even some elephants. All the images also have a really distinct style to them. And the distinct style seems to be continuing on with nature images. For landscapes we seem to get quite many buildings. Elephants in the wildlife images. And again totally random Santa Clauses in macro images. The amount of details in all of these images is astonishing. Really detailed images continue with architecture-related images. There is still a certain style to them, although not as prominent. And I have absolutely no idea if the Discworld architecture is supposed to look like this. A lot of detail in portraits, fantasy and sci-fi as well. And elephants, turtles and Santa Clauses. Leaving Discworld, we journey to the magical land of Oz, a place of wonder and enchantment made famous by L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy and her companions encounter witches, flying monkeys, and the great wizard himself. This is a fantasy world that I am aware of, but possibly not that familiar with. I don't even think I've seen the movie. But I know of it via pop culture and from references in all kinds of TV series that I've watched in the past, like Once Upon a Time or Supernatural. And we get some really nice looking images with the name of this fantasy world. In nature images we seem to get the landscapes along with the almost yellow brick road. Wildlife is looking stylistically totally different and not fitting with the world. But macro again has some wonderfully weird random stuff for us that definitely does not look like macro. The Oz cities seem to look more like futuristic or alien cities. Kind of fitting look for the interiors. Architecture has some great houses, but not sure if these would be out of the world of Oz. Could these portraits be of the Wizard of Oz? Fantasy has quite a random variety of nice images for us. And sci-fi is basically looking like it always does, except the huge robot dog in the lower right is kind of new. Next, we delve into Earthsea, a sprawling archipelago created by Ursula K. Le Guin, where wizards harness the power of true names and navigate the delicate balance between life, death, and the forces of nature. Yet another one I am not at all familiar with and had not even heard of before. But it has a really distinct look to it. Sea, ships, dragons and a boy or young man seem to be recurring themes in these images. And we see the sea in the nature-related images as well. The distinct style can still be seen in these images, but not as prominently as with just the name of the fantasy world. Macro again does its own thing and does not look like macro at all. I think the style is emphasized more in the macro images. The sea themes continue with architecture-related images too. I am not sure again if the architecture of this world is supposed to look like this, but it definitely looks different. Although the recurring theme from Midjourney's side seems to be the chaotic constructions of the houses where some parts of the house have been added on over time. And the room has kind of run out, so there has been a need to expand wider from the top. Surprisingly, the portraits, fantasy and sci-fi are very much affected by the fantasy world style. The similar-looking boy or young man can be seen in these images. And sci-fi has a total lack of anything sci-fi in the images. Leaving Earthsea, we enter the whimsical realm of Xanth, a pun-filled land of magic and adventure created by Piers Anthony, where every citizen possesses a unique magical talent and extraordinary creatures abound. And again a world I have absolutely no familiarity at all. Never heard of it before I decided to look up famous fantasy worlds. So again this has a very distinct look and coloration. And there's lots of angry dragons, I don't know why they're so mad. The landscapes look really pretty. Wildlife looks like Midjourney 5.1 default style. And macro is looking similar to the prompts with just the word Xanth. Very stacked cities and houses with an abundance of tiny details. And interiors have yet again another look to them, although still staying in the realm of fantasy. Not sure if any of the images are looking like they're from the realm of Xanth though. And similarly to the last fantasy world, we do get a similar style as with just the word Xanth in the last 3 image grids. Still lots of dragons. And sci-fi has one image looking almost sci-fi with the lightsaber. From Xanth, we find ourselves in Prydain, the mythical land brought to life in Lloyd Alexander's Chronicles of Prydain series, where a young assistant pig keeper named Taran embarks on a heroic journey of self-discovery and battles the forces of evil. And another one of worlds that I had absolutely no idea about before making this video. But I do like the style that it brings to the images. It's kind of medieval Art Nouveau. It is kind of scaled back with the landscape images, but the landscapes still look quite different from the usual. There is a slight Art Nouveau look also in the wildlife images. But macro is totally embracing it again. Also, the totally random images in macro are appearing. I guess fantasy worlds and macro photography doesn't really fit together, and even Midjourney can't blend the two. The cities seem to have kind of an anime or cartoon look here. Interiors look very medieval, as does architecture. And look, the distinct Art Nouveau look is not present here as strongly. But it is back with the last set of images. Although the portraits look like they're kind of photorealistic and the background goes full on Art Nouveau. Sci-fi is getting a great look from this. The thematic of the images, big orbs, spaceships and people standing around, is the same as before, but there is kind of an overlay of a different style. Leaving the world of Prydain behind, we enter the realm of Eorzea, a vibrant and ever-evolving world within the popular MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV, where adventurers embark on epic quests, engage in battles, and forge alliances in a realm teeming with diverse races and rich lore. But now we get back to a fantasy world I am actually familiar with, because of it being the game I played for some time before I discovered Midjourney and forgot that gaming exists. I mean, if I go back in time and look at my very first Midjourney prompts, I tried to prompt something related to Final Fantasy quite many times. The look of these images does give a hint of Eorzea. And the characters posing in all kinds of clothes and armor are an essential part of Final Fantasy. The landscapes don't look anything like Eorzea. Wildlife kind of does. And macro is again the closest, with the characters posing in armor, and the fierce robot in the top right fits very well too. Surprising lack of catgirls though. Architecture images look kind of like Eorzea, but not entirely. There's some strange places these. I haven't actually played the other Final Fantasy games in the franchise yet, so I don't know if the look of those could be kind of influencing the fact that I don't recognize any of these places. Portraits and fantasy certainly have some Final Fantasy look to them, although still no catgirls or Viera. I swear, most of the people in the game are playing as Mikotes, so it's strange that it is not visible in these images. Sci-fi seems to force the Eorzea to not so Eorzea, but the look is still quite nice in my opinion. Stepping through the looking glass, we find ourselves in Wonderland, the whimsical and nonsensical realm crafted by Lewis Carroll in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, where curious adventures and perplexing riddles await around every corner. I think I've read the book at some point of my life, but so long ago I don't really remember much of it. But we do seem to have Alice, some bunnies and lots of mushrooms. And the usual craziness that goes along with Midjourney version 5.1. So this fantasy world is basically similar to the Midjourney's own style, just with extra mushrooms. But it looks whimsical, that's why I wanted to show you this one. Very whimsical cities and architecture, and also the interiors. So many mushrooms. And it seems that the hot air balloons of Midjourney 5.1 are showing up as well in the city images. Not sure if these are what they're supposed to look like, but fun nonetheless. Portraits seem to be giving Alice some red hair. And the sci-fi images look great with the mushroom forests, really alien-looking environments. Finally, we sail off to Neverland, the timeless and magical island in J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, where dreams come true, children never grow up, and pirates clash with fairies in a world of eternal youth and enchantment. This is another familiar world for me, although I don't remember much of it. I think I've seen an animated movie about it and read the book possibly at some point. But the images have kind of a tropic island treehouse vibe to them very fittingly. In nature images there is some Midjourney default style seeping through, but the images do seem to retain the colors and feel of them despite the insane amount of tiny details thrown in them as well. I wonder how no maximalism would work. Would it reduce the amount of detail in the images? The architecture-related images do look great, but sometimes I wonder what the images would look like without looking like hidden item games. And as a side note, I just did prompt one of these images with no maximalism and the images looked gorgeous. So a good tip to try for all of you still watching this video. And in portraits we seem to possibly get Peter Pan. Treehouses in fantasy images and futuristic treehouses in sci-fi. So this was the end of these. I think we proved that if you prompt for a fantasy world's name you will get some small references with Midjourney v5.1. But not actually like screenshots of movies or video games that would look recognizable. I guess the entire fantasy world is a really wide subject to picture in one image. There was a surprising lack of maps which I would have expected to see quite often. Simply because if you Google some of the fantasy world, the majority of images you get are maps. Possibly the 5.0 or 5.1 raw style would have had some maps in there somewhere. But I really hope you have been inspired by this exploration of fantasy worlds. And if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to my channel. I also appreciate all likes and comments as well. I got some good feedback about my last video as well in the comments section, so thank you for everyone's honest opinions. And let's continue prompting.